talking about the long range meta for Warzone after season 6. Decided to do this video a little bit different to kind of give you different perspectives other than my own. There's tons of different websites that show different loadouts. We got Warzone stats, we got Warzone rank, we got TGD, which is true game data, and then we also have COD community. And I've done some power rankings based off of this information. When you go ahead and put these all head to head, obviously they do have differing opinions, but when it comes to the #1 gun at the long range meta, even after the subtle nerf to the DTIR 30-06, we end up with this at the #1 spot. Once we get out of there, then we have differing opinions on what's the second best, third best, fourth best. And when you kind of consolidate them all, you end up with this power ranking that we see here on the right hand side. And they used varying information to kind of build their preferences. True game data does it almost just based off data alone. I think Warzone stats, COD community, and Warzone ranked use different filter options to kind of identify what they believe is the meta based off feel or what people are searching for, those different variables that go into it. One thing that is consistent when we are talking about the top 7 or so weapons is the loadouts are almost identical. From website to website, including my own, they're generally pretty identical, which is unfortunate because when you have 70 attachments at the muzzle slot and you only get to use one because one is that much more dominant, it kind of ends up with like, why do we have all these other attachments? And I think that's kind of a problem. Probably around the 5 to 8 range, some slight differences. Maybe one person will use one ammo type, which is high grain versus high velocity. Maybe somebody will use an underbarrel instead of a stock, but generally the attachments are almost the exact same. That being said, we're going to give you a loadout for all of the ones on this list, kind of incorporating all the information from here and my own individual preferences. I'm still getting over a cold, so excuse my voice, but we'll go ahead and go through these starting with the MTZ, keeping in mind that depending on the site, they kind of rank these higher or lower depending on how they rate their individual metrics. So you end up with a loadout that looks similar like this, the MTZ 556, pretty much the same loadout that we carried over from last season. Optics can be different depending on what you prefer. Some people go with the NIDAR, some is the Choreo Eagle Eye, especially if you're doing really long range. Then you got the Jack Glassless. Those are kind of the main 3. Obviously, there's some other ones in the mix that you might want to use depending on if you're going to use it as sniper support or whatever the case is. And this is generally how the weapon will perform. Overall, not a ton of recoil. Pretty straightforward. It'll be nice once we get the firing range with the integration that it'll actually match the Warzone stats so we can actually put on plates by default. But overall, pretty accurate weapon. I wish it had a 60 round mag and then it would probably be even more higher up on the power rankings in my opinion. But the 50 round mag is a little bit limiting, especially since this isn't a high damage weapon. Next one is the MCW and the BAL, which are both pretty solid guns. I think one of the biggest problems with the BAL is it does have some issues where you wish it had less recoil, so you go ahead and put on an attachment for less recoil, but then it doesn't have enough muzzle velocity, sitting at 884, not particularly good. But it does have a decent aim down sight speed, so it is a little bit recoverable. If you want to drop the optic, you can go ahead and do that as well to go ahead and put on some ammunition to offset that, either with high velocity or high grain, depending on your preference. And then you end up with some iron sights that look like this, which for some, that's fine. Maybe if you're going to use this as a little bit closer range, but then you lose that ability with the optic. Luckily, its iron sights aren't that atrocious that you could get away with that. But for me, at long range engagements, I definitely still prefer an optic. So that's kind of how this one will look. Like I said, you could trade that part off based off what we've seen in the other websites there. You could choose pretty much whichever one works for you. They've brought the recoil down a ton on this weapon, so it's significantly easier to use and you can shoot very straight with it. That brings us to the MCW, which is also a pretty solid option. This one, you can see they've gone with kind of the high green rounds. I think that's a good option because that'll push us over 1,000 muzzle velocity, bullet velocity, especially with this quartermaster coming in and kind of taking over and dominating that slot. You could also get rid of the optic, maybe put on a stock if you want to reduce the recoil. That's pretty much how this will build out. And you can see not a ton of recoil, pretty straightforward. I wish we had a little bit better firing range without these dividers, but you can kind of see how this one builds out. Pretty nice, solid gun. It's been the multiplayer meta for ranked for quite a while with a few other guns since everything else gets banned, but that's kind of how that part works. Then we get into the TAC Eradicator with the SVA. We've used the SVA for a while. They kind of nerfed it, then they buffed it, then they nerfed it, and then they buffed it, and they really didn't nerf it or buff it that much. They kind of just moved the range of drop off a little bit here and there, and I think they fine-tuned it where it's maybe not the hard meta, it's just super brain dead, easy to use at the furthest range, especially when you put it in the burst fire. because of the extra muzzle that we have now, we're able to combine that. The other thing you could do is get rid of the ammunition, and then you can go ahead and put on a stock. And that's probably the way I would go generally. You'd go ahead and go with the one that's going to go ahead and reduce the most amount of recoil, which is the main V6. And even though it doesn't have a ton of recoil, you're gonna get a tighter bullet spread when you combine the stock. If you really wanna go all in on that, you can get rid of the optic, and then you can actually go with the ammunition. So it does have a couple different trade-offs. This one's gonna be the lower recoil version here, where the bullet spread is very tight. And when you're going and spam this trigger, you'll be able to hit that max trigger cap, and you're gonna go ahead and delete because both bullets are going to register where you're aiming. And that is a nice thing with this gun versus without this stock. Maybe it's a little bit less consistent on that bullet spread, and only 1/2 of those bullets is actually going to register on the target. So just to give you an example of the ammunition one, maybe you go high velocity, and then when you go ahead and equip that, you're going to have iron sights. Again, this could be good if you obviously don't need to aim, and you're going to get max muzzle velocity, bullet velocity, while being able to essentially just shoot straight and hit the target without having to really adjust your aim. Both bullets will go where they go. But again, that's a little bit unforgiving. You got to kind of zoom in and see where the target is, especially since the irons, the back irons and the front irons move differently. So again, multiple options there to kind of experiment, but that's kind of where it sits. TAC Eradicator has the weird rate of fire change. I think with this one, pretty much you would get rid of the optic and then put on ammunition because this is a TAC base. It's going to have the TAC iron sights. So TAC 56, TAC Eradicator, TAC Evolver, they're all very similar. So you could go ahead and rock it this way with this particular build, and you're going to be able to, you know, pretty much use it that way. But if you want a little bit extra bullet velocity, you can actually do that. So instead of 1,000, you can actually go even higher. And just take advantage of that and maybe go high velocity in this case again, or you can put in a rear grip or whatever the case is. So it'll be a pretty good option as well, especially if you like the TAC iron sights. And with this type of build, you're going to get insane bullet velocity up to 1,300, which is a lot. That is a lot. You're going to get hit scan up to like 65 meters. That is huge. And then we have the Pulemyot and the Holger 5.56. As you can see, there was a lot of tying in this area of the meta. Obviously outside, once you get outside of that first, there was a little bit of mixes and opinions on those different various weapons. When it comes to the Pulemyot, we rocking the new hidden camo that you get for using aftermarket parts, conversion kits, getting kills in multi, zombies, or Warzone. But regardless, here's kind of the build that we have it out. Obviously, LMGs aren't usually the most fan favorites for multiple different reasons, but overall it's a pretty solid build. You get a good rate of fire, good TTK, good muzzle velocity, bullet velocity at 1100 ish. It is a little bit slow at 457 aim down sight speed, but you're taking care of all the bases here, and it's going to get good TTKs, easy to use. You're going to get stuck reloading, so you want to pair this with the right SMG, which the static kind of covers that base, but there's multiple SMGs that kind of fit into there. Holger 5.56. This is definitely one of those ones that's kind of had a similar build. I think with this one as well, you can swap the stock for the ammo. It only has 800 bullet velocity, so it's a little bit of a weakness. This is kind of like the bow, where this would benefit so much from having a 6th or 7th attachment, which we'll get after the integration, where you'll be able to equip the ammunition for free instead of having to sacrifice the stock. So initially, this one again is going to be a low fire rate weapon relative to some of the weapons we talked about. So in the firing range, not as big of an issue. Once we get a little bit further ranges, you'll definitely notice that fall off in muzzle velocity, bullet velocity. So whereas you could drop the stat and go ahead and put on either high grain or you go with high velocity, which will impact your range a bit, but its range goes pretty far, up to about 70 meters. So I'd probably go high velocity so you don't have to worsen the recoil. And then you're going to have a little bit more muzzle velocity, and this should help at those further ranges that you're going to be challenging targets. Just that little bit of extra bullet velocity, almost up to 1,000 there, is definitely a little bit more viable than the 800. And then that brings us to the top two, which the STG did get a slight nerf. Now I believe it's gone through now. They delayed it for whatever reason. Its TTK is a little bit slower, but it's still super easy to use. And then we also have the DTIR 30-06. So pretty much you kind of have the same build we've had for a while. The only discrepancy sometimes with this is sometimes people go with the first barrel. I think most people have kind of leaned in towards a C70 barrel, and that's kind of what people are sticking to. Overall, this has been the meta for already 2 months, so you should already have a build essentially for this weapon. It's not particularly hard to use. It doesn't have much recoil. It just does a little bit less damage and has a little bit less range than it did before the update. But as you can see there, the minimum drop off, 66 meters. If it's within that, it's still going to kill relatively fast. And then the almost 1200 bullet velocity is huge for the bullet registration. And then we get the DTIR, which this is kind of the barrel that a lot of people have gone with. I think, again, this one's kind of the split where you might want to go the third, even though it'll slow you down a little bit. It can tighten up that recoil if you feel it's getting a little bit out of hand. But a lot of people, I think, are just leaning towards this one because this is the first one you unlock and really haven't experimented. It gets the job done either way. It's not that big a deal. With the way the weapon builds out, you get about 1100 bullet velocity, which is more than enough. The stock, and I think the blueprint that it comes with is already like a default build. Biggest problem with this one is it has a slower fire rate. It is a bar essentially version, modernized, so it does feel like the bar because it's the modern day bar. It's super easy to use, and I think that's why a lot of people are liking it. And even after they did a rush nerf to it, that nerf primarily impacted the point blank range, so it's less viable up close, but still pretty good across the board. That's it for the long range meta. See you on the next one. Thank you for watching. As always, have a great day.